My stepchildren spent 6 years making me feel unwelcome in my own home, and my husband never once said a word. I want to be precise about this because I think precision matters when you are trying to be fair. They were never cruel. Nothing they did was ever something I could point to cleanly and say, there, that is the thing, that is the moment. It was never that simple. It was smaller than that. It was 1,000 small things across 6 years that individually meant nothing and together meant everything. I think that is actually the harder version of this story to tell. The clean version, the one with a villain and a clear offense and an obvious response, that version is easier to understand and easier to explain to the people in your life who want to help but need something concrete to be outraged about. What I have is not that version. What I have is 6 years of small things. My name is Carolyn Drake. I am 56 years old. I spent 30 years as a cardiothoracic surgeon, not because it was expected of me, not because anyone pointed me in that direction, but because at 22 I watched a surgeon repair a heart that should not have been repairable, and I understood in that moment, with complete clarity, what I wanted my life to be about. I retired 3 years ago, not because I had to. My hands were still steady, my mind still sharp, but because I had spent 30 years giving everything I had to that operating room, and I wanted, before too much time passed, to find out what else I was. I am telling you this because I want you to understand who I am before I tell you what I allowed. I am not a passive woman. I am not someone who lacks language for what she observes or courage for what she needs to say. I have delivered news to families that I would not wish on anyone. I have had conversations that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. And yet, for 6 years, I said nothing. I met Robert Drake at a fundraising dinner 7 years ago. He was a recently retired civil engineer, 61, widowed 4 years earlier, the kind of man who listened when you spoke and remembered what you said. We were seated next to each other by the particular accident of alphabetical placement, and we talked for 3 hours. And I drove home thinking about the conversation in the specific way you think about something when you know it is going to matter. He was warm. He was steady. He had a quality I can only describe as deliberate. He did not say things carelessly, did not make promises he had not already thought through. After 30 years of making life and death decisions in pressurized environments, I found that quality deeply attractive. We dated for a year. We were careful with each other in the way that people are careful the second time, aware of what they are risking, aware of what they have already lost. I had been married once before, briefly, in my early 30s. A good man, wrong timing, an ending that was sad rather than dramatic. Robert had been married for 28 years to a woman named Patricia, who died of pancreatic cancer at 58. He spoke of her with love and without apology, and I respected that completely. What I did not fully account for, what I understood intellectually but did not feel in my body until it was too late to matter, was what 28 years of one marriage looks like from the inside of a family that grew up inside it. Robert had 3 children. Melissa, the eldest, was 34 when we married. Then Daniel, 31. Then Sophie, 28. They were, all 3 of them, adults when I came into their lives. I want to be clear about that because it matters to the shape of this story. I was not a stepmother in the traditional sense. There were no children to raise, no school pickups, no territory to negotiate over homework and bedtimes. They were grown. They had their own lives, their own homes, their own families beginning to form. What they had, still and completely, was their father. And what I was, from the moment Robert introduced me, was the woman who had him in a way they did not. I understood that. I gave them room for it. I told Robert early in our relationship that I expected nothing from his children. Not warmth, not acceptance, not the performance of a family we had not earned yet. These things take time, and I was prepared to give time. What I was not prepared for was that time would not be the variable. The first year, I attributed everything to grief. Melissa in particular, she had been closest to her mother, carried the loss most visibly. She was polite at family dinners in the way that costs something. She answered my questions with the minimum required and never asked any of her own. She called her father every Sunday, and those calls, I noticed early, happened privately. He would take them in another room, door closed, and come back afterwards slightly quieter than before. I did not ask about the calls. I told myself it was not my place. Daniel was more neutral, present at gatherings, occasionally funny, never quite landing on anything that felt like genuine engagement. He and his wife Carol were the most functional part of the early years. Carol was kind to me in the careful way of a woman who was managing several loyalties at once and doing her best. Sophie was the youngest and the most like her father, warm in temperament, easy to be around. She was the one I had the most hope for in the beginning. She was also the one who, I would later understand, was paying the most careful attention. I moved into Robert's house after the wedding. This was our first real decision, the house question, and we discussed it at length. His house was larger. It was paid for. It had a garden I genuinely loved, and a kitchen that had been renovated properly, and a study that became mine, and that I arranged with the particular pleasure of someone claiming a space. It was also the house his children had grown up in, the house their mother had lived in for 24 years. Robert asked me once, carefully, in the way he asked careful things, whether I was certain, whether I wanted us to find somewhere new, somewhere that belonged to both of us equally. I said I was certain. I believed it when I said it. The first small thing happened 3 months after we married. I had rearranged the living room, not dramatically. I moved 2 chairs, replaced a side table that was genuinely falling apart, added a lamp near the window where the light was good for reading. Practical changes, small ones. Melissa came for dinner that weekend and walked into the living room and stopped. She did not say anything to me. She went to find her father. I was in the kitchen and I heard not the words, just the tone. The particular tone of someone registering a complaint. Robert came back to the kitchen a few minutes later and said gently that perhaps we might want to make changes more gradually, that it was an adjustment for the children. The children, they were 34, 31, and 28. I said, of course. I said I understood. I moved one of the chairs back and I filed it away, the way I had been trained to file things that didn't have a clear diagnosis yet, not dismissing it, just waiting for more information. 6 years is a long time to collect information. By the time my daughter called me on a Tuesday afternoon last spring and said the 3 sentences I had not known I needed to hear, I had a file in my head that was considerable. She had never met Robert's children more than twice. She had no investment in being right. She had only, as she told me, been watching my face at Christmas. Mom, she said, you look like a guest in that house. You have looked like a guest for as long as I can remember, and I don't think you've noticed. I had noticed. That was the thing I had to sit with. I had noticed every single thing. I had simply for 6 years decided that noticing was enough. I have a habit, professional, deeply ingrained, of writing things down, not journaling. I have never been a journal person, but lists, observations, the kind of precise notations that allow you to see a pattern that sentiment would obscure. After my daughter's phone call, I sat in my study for an hour and I wrote down everything I could remember. Every small thing, 6 years of them. I filled 4 pages. I want to tell you some of what was on those pages because I think the specifics matter. I think the specifics are the difference between a story that sounds like self-pity and a story that sounds like what it actually was. The rearranged chairs, that was the first one. Then there was the matter of Christmas. Robert's family had a Christmas tradition. The children came on Christmas Eve, stayed through Christmas morning, a specific order of events that had apparently been consistent for years. Tree in the evening, stockings at midnight, breakfast together before gifts. I had my own tradition. My daughter Claire and her family, her husband and their 2 children, had always come to me on Christmas morning. Always. It had been our thing for 11 years. The first Christmas after Robert and I married, I suggested we host both. A larger table, more people, the particular warmth of a full house. Melissa said she wasn't comfortable with strangers at Christmas. She said it to Robert, not to me. Robert said, gently, carefully, in the way he said difficult things, that perhaps this first year we should keep things simple. Claire and her family went to her in-laws that year, and the year after, and the year after that, there was the matter of the study. I had arranged it as mine. My books, my desk, my reading chair. This was agreed upon. Robert had his own space, a smaller room at the back of the house where he kept his engineering texts and his drafting table from the old days. Daniel came to visit one weekend with his wife Carol and their daughter, a bright 7-year-old named Emma, who I was genuinely fond of. Emma wandered into the study while I was in the kitchen. When I came back, she was sitting in my reading chair looking at the framed photographs on the desk. She looked up at me with the uncomplicated curiosity of a child and said, "My dad says this used to be Grandma Patricia's sewing room." I said, "It was. Now it's my study." She nodded and went back to the photographs. That evening, I heard Daniel tell Robert that he found it strange, the word he used was strange, that I had put my things in his mother's sewing room. Robert said he would talk to me about it. He never did. I waited. He never did. There was the matter of holidays in general. Thanksgiving, Easter, the occasional birthday dinner. These gatherings had a quality I spent a long time trying to name precisely. They were not hostile. The food was good and the conversation was functional and nobody was ever openly unkind. What they were was arranged around an absence. Patricia's absence, specifically. She came up often. Stories, references, the particular shorthand of a family that had been a family for a long time. This was natural and I understood it and I did not begrudge it. What I noticed was the way I was arranged around it. Seated at the far end of the table from Robert at larger gatherings, Melissa managed the seating, always had. Conversations that started before I arrived and resumed after I left the room. Family photographs from the old days displayed throughout the house, which was fine, which was appropriate, and not a single photograph of Robert and me anywhere in the common rooms. There was one, on his desk in his study. A good one from our wedding. I had not put it there. He had, which meant he knew. That was the thing I kept returning to as I sat in my study with my 4 pages of notes. Robert knew. Not everything, perhaps. Not the full accumulated weight of it. But he was not an unobservant man. I had loved him in part because he was not an unobservant man. And some of what was on my 4 pages he had been present for. The Christmas. The study. The seating arrangements. He had seen those things. And he had said, across 6 years, very little. I had told myself it was because he was managing a difficult situation carefully. That he was protecting me from worse by not making issues of small things. That he was, in his deliberate, measured way, working towards something better gradually. Sitting with my 4 pages, I was no longer certain that was what it was. I called my friend Janet. Janet and I have been friends for 22 years. We met during my residency. She was in internal medicine. We have survived each other's worst decisions and best ones, and everything in between. She is the person I call when I need someone who will be honest without being cruel, which is a rarer combination than people acknowledge. I told her about the phone call from Claire. I told her about the 4 pages. She listened without interrupting. She has always been good at that. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "In 6 years, have you ever told Robert directly, not suggested, not implied, not hoped he would notice? Have you ever told him directly that you feel like a guest in your own home?" I opened my mouth and closed it. "Carolyn, I didn't want to be the woman who complained about his children." "I know," she said, "but there's a difference between complaining about his children and telling your husband husband how you feel in your own marriage. I looked at my 4 pages. I know that, I said. Do you? The thing about being a surgeon, about spending 30 years in an environment that requires absolute precision and zero ambiguity, is that you develop an almost physical aversion to uncertainty in your professional life. What I had not fully understood until that afternoon was how completely I had transferred all of my tolerance for uncertainty into my personal one. I had spent 6 years being precise about everything except the thing that mattered most. Robert came home that evening to find me in the kitchen. I had not made dinner. I had sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours and had not moved and had not made dinner. He came in and read the room the way he always did, carefully, without rushing to fill it, and he sat down across from me. Claire called, I said. I know, he said. She called me too. I looked at him. She called you. This afternoon. She wanted me to know what she said to you. She wanted me to know she had said it. I sat with that for a moment. My daughter, who had watched my face at Christmas, had not only called me, she had called my husband. She had covered the exit I might have used. Did you know? I asked. That I felt like a guest. Robert looked at the table. That look, that specific, careful, downward look, told me everything before he said a word. I thought, he said slowly, that you were handling it. You handle things so well, Carolyn. You always have. I think I let that be a reason not to ask. We sat at that kitchen table for a long time, and Robert said something toward the end of it that I had not expected. Not because it was dramatic, not because it was a revelation, but because it was the first completely unmanaged thing he had said to me in a long time. He said, I owe you more than I have given you. I think I have known that for a while. And then he said, I need to talk to my children. I watched his face when he said it. It was the face of a man who had been avoiding something and had finally, quietly, decided to stop. I did not say anything, but something in me, some specific tightly held thing that had been in place for 6 years, shifted slightly. Not gone, just shifted. Robert spoke to his children over the course of 4 days. Not one conversation, 3 separate ones, because he is a man who understands that his children are 3 different people who needed 3 different versions of the same truth. I appreciated that about him. I did not ask for details of each conversation. I told him that what he said to them was his to manage, and what came back to me was what I would work with. He nodded, and I believed he understood what I meant. He called Melissa first. I know this because Melissa called me 2 days later. She asked if she could come over. Not to the house, she specified that, which I noted. She suggested a restaurant near her office, a place I had never been, neutral ground in the way that my mother's kitchen was neutral ground, and my kitchen was not. I said yes. I drove to that restaurant the way I have driven to difficult things my entire life, without rehearsing, without preparing a position, because I have learned over many years that prepared positions are performances, and performances prevent actual conversation. She was already there when I arrived. Melissa is 39 now. She was 33 when I married her father, and I have watched 6 years of her adult life from a careful distance. She is capable and guarded and loves her father with the particular intensity of someone who nearly lost him once and has never fully recovered from how close it was. She stood when I came in. We did not hug. We have never hugged. We sat down. She spoke first, which surprised me. I owe you an apology, she said. I have been thinking about how to say that for 2 days, and I have decided that the most honest version is also the simplest one. I owe you an apology. I waited. I know what I did, she said. Not all of it consciously. Some of it I told myself was just protecting what we had. Our family, our traditions, the way things were. She paused. I told myself you were fine, that you were strong enough to not need inclusion, that you didn't need it the way other people might. And now, I said, now my father called me and told me that his wife of 6 years feels like a guest in her own home. And I had to sit with the fact that I knew that, and I called it something else. I looked at her. There was something in her face I had not seen before. Not in 6 years of careful, polite dinners and managed gatherings. Something underneath the guardedness. Something that looked, if I was reading it correctly, like genuine exhaustion. Can I tell you something? She said. And I need you to hear it as not an excuse, as a context. Go ahead, I said. She told me about the last year of her mother's life. I knew the broad shape of it. Pancreatic cancer, rapid progression, 14 months from diagnosis to the end. Robert had told me the outline. The children had never offered more than that, and I had never asked for more. What Melissa told me was the interior of it, the specific weight of being the eldest, of being the one who coordinated the medical appointments and managed the information and translated the doctors for her father, who, for all his steadiness, had come apart in those 14 months in ways his children had quietly held together around him. She had been 28 years old. She told me about the last conversation she had had with her mother, what her mother had said about the house, that she wanted it to stay in the family, to stay the way it was, to be the place the children came back to, what her mother had not said, but what Melissa had understood as clearly as if she had. Don't let anyone replace me in it. I know that wasn't fair to put on you, Melissa said. I know she didn't mean it as an instruction. She was dying and she was afraid, and she said the things afraid people say. But you carried it anyway, I said. I carried it anyway. I sat with that for a moment. I thought about being 28 years old and translating doctors for your father and holding a family together and carrying a dying woman's fear as if it were a promise. I thought about a chair I had moved and put back. I thought about 6 years of Christmas mornings without my daughter, and I felt something I had not expected to feel sitting across from Melissa. I felt sorrow for her. Not instead of what I felt for myself, alongside it. Both things at once, which is how real things usually are. I want to say something to you, I said, and I mean it precisely, so I need you to hear it precisely. She nodded. I am not trying to replace your your mother. I have never been trying to replace your mother. I don't want her photographs taken down or her traditions changed or the way your family remembers her altered in any way. That was never what I wanted. What did you want? She asked. To be in my own home, I said simply. To have my daughter at Christmas. To be introduced as Robert's wife rather than present. That's all. That is the full extent of what I wanted. Melissa looked at the table. That's not a lot, she said quietly. No, I said, it isn't. We sat there for another hour. I will not tell you it was easy or that it resolved everything cleanly because it did neither. There were long pauses, and there were moments where one or both of us was choosing words with the care of someone who understood that the wrong ones would cost something. But it was honest. For the first time in 6 years, I was having an honest conversation with my husband's eldest daughter. Not a managed one, not a performed one, an honest one, and I found by the end of it that I liked her. Not in spite of what she had done, or alongside it maybe, in the complicated way that understanding someone does not excuse them but does make them human in a way that changes what you can feel about them. She had been 28 years old and she had been given an impossible thing to carry. She had carried it in the wrong direction, but she had been carrying it. The conversation with Daniel was shorter and quieter. He came to the house, Robert's idea, not mine, and I respected it. He sat in the living room in the rearranged chairs, and he said that he had not thought carefully enough about what his behavior communicated, and that he was sorry for it. He said it simply and without elaboration, and I believed him and I told him so. His wife Carol, who had been kind to me all along in her careful way, texted me that evening. Thank you for being patient with us. I know it cost you. I appreciated that more than I told her. Sophie was the one I had not expected. Robert's call to her had not gone the way his calls to the others had. He had not told me this directly, but I had learned to read him in 6 years the way you learn to read any terrain you inhabit long enough, by the small signs, the quality of silence, the particular way he carried himself when something was unresolved. Sophie called me herself. Not to meet, not to apologize, to ask me a question. Did you ever tell Dad? She said. What it was like. Did you ever actually tell him? Not directly, I said. Not the way I should have. A pause. Can I tell you something without you taking it the wrong way? You can try, I said. I think, she said carefully, that we let you down. All of us, including Dad. But I also think, and I say this because I think you're someone who can hear it, I think you let yourself down a little too. You're not a woman who doesn't have words. You had words. You just didn't use them. I stood at my kitchen window and looked at the garden. No, I said. I didn't. Why? I thought about it. Because I didn't want to need to, I said. I thought if I was patient enough and steady enough, it would resolve itself. I think I was waiting for something that was never going to happen on its own. Yeah, Sophie said quietly. I think so too. That night, Robert and I sat in the living room after dinner. He asked me what I needed. Not what I wanted, what I needed. The specific, careful word choice of a man who had been thinking about the difference. I looked at the room around me, the photographs on the walls, the chair I had moved and put back, the lamp by the window that was still there because nobody had asked me to move it. I thought about what I needed, and for the first time in 6 years, I answered that question honestly. Not carefully, not diplomatically, not with one eye on how it would land. Honestly, and what came out surprised even me. What I told Robert was this. I needed the house to feel like mine, not instead of Patricia's. I was precise about that, because precision mattered, and I did not want to be misunderstood on the one point that I needed him to understand clearly. I was not asking him to remove her from the house. I was not asking him to diminish what she had been to this family or what she still was to his children. I was asking for one photograph of us in the living room. I was asking for Claire at Christmas. I was asking for him to be present, in the room, in the conversation, at the table, in the way that a husband is present, not managing, not buffering, present. That was all. He listened to all of it. He did not say it wasn't a lot the way Melissa had. He said, I should have asked you this years ago. And then he said, I'm sorry I didn't. I want to tell you what happened after that, because I think it matters and because I think the after is usually the part that gets left out of these stories. Things did not change overnight. That is the honest version, and I am committed to the honest version. Melissa came to Christmas that year. So did Claire and her husband and my 2 grandchildren who are 7 and 4, and who approached the day with the uncomplicated enthusiasm of people who have not yet learned to find gatherings complicated. There was a moment, early in the afternoon, the children running through the living room, Robert's family and my family occupying the same space for the first time, where I stood in the kitchen doorway and watched it and felt something settle, not resolve, settle. There is a difference. The photograph went up in February. Robert found a frame, a good one, simple, not competing with anything around it, and asked me which photo I wanted. I chose one from a trip we had taken to Portugal 2 years ago. We are both laughing in it at something I no longer remember, and we look, I think, like people who chose each other deliberately. He hung it himself on a Sunday morning while I was making coffee. When I walked into the living room and saw it, I stood there for a moment. He came up beside me. Neither of us said anything. Sometimes the small things are the whole thing. I need to tell you about Sophie. Of the 3 children she has become, gradually and without ceremony, the one I talk to most honestly. Not because she is easiest, she is not always easy, but because she is the one who said the true thing on the phone that afternoon. The thing about having words and not using them. She was right. I had spent 30 years in operating rooms making the most consequential decisions of my professional life with complete clarity, and I had come home and been a different person entirely, patient to a fault, waiting for things to change without saying clearly what needed to change. I have thought about why. I think, and this is me being honest with myself in the way Sophie asked me to be, I think I was afraid afraid, not of Robert's children, not of conflict, of needing something and not getting it. There is a specific kind of protection in not asking. If you never ask, you can never be told no. I had been telling myself I was being patient and gracious and reasonable, and all of those things were true. And underneath all of them was a woman who was afraid to say this is what I need because she had spent 6 years not being certain she would be heard. That is the part I had to sit with, not what they did to me. What I did with it. My daughter Claire came to visit in the spring. We sat in the garden I had loved from the beginning, the one that had been part of why I said yes to staying in this house. And she asked me how things were. I told her. All of it. The conversations with Melissa and Daniel and Sophie, the photograph Christmas, the things Robert had said at the kitchen table, and the things I had finally said back. She listened the way she has always listened, which is a gift she got from somewhere that is not entirely from me. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You seem like yourself again." I thought about that. I think, I said, I let myself get a little lost in there. I know, she said. That's why I called. I think about Patricia sometimes. Not with resentment, that past, if it was ever really resentment and not something smaller and more confused. I think about her with something closer to understanding. She loved this house. She loved her children. She was afraid at the end of being replaced in both. I understand that fear. I would not have understood it 10 years ago. I was not 10 years ago, a woman who had loved someone enough to be afraid of losing the evidence of it. I am now. She was not my adversary. She was a woman who died too young and left behind people who loved her and did not know what to do with that love once she was gone. I happened to be the one standing in the room when they figured it out. There is one more thing I want to tell you. Last Thanksgiving, or the most recent one, 4 months ago, we were all at the table. Robert's children, their families, Claire and her family, 8 people and 2 children who needed to be redirected from the dessert table approximately every 12 minutes. Melissa had brought her mother's sweet potato recipe. She told me that before dinner, stood in the kitchen and told me directly that it was her mother's recipe and that she brought it every year and she hoped that was all right. I told her it was more than all right. I told her I was glad she brought it. She nodded and went back to the living room, and that was the entirety of the exchange, and it was also, in its small, precise way, everything. After dinner, after the dishes and the children and the particular warm exhaustion of a house full of people, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and Robert sat across from me, and we were quiet together in the way we are quiet together when things are right. He reached across the table and covered my hand with his. I thought about a woman I had been 6 years ago, moving a chair back because someone was uncomfortable, filing it away, waiting. I thought about 4 pages of small things. I thought about my daughter watching my face at Christmas and picking up the phone. I thought about precision, about the 30 years I spent applying it to everything that mattered, and the 6 years I spent withholding it from the thing that mattered most. I am not that woman anymore. Not because the circumstances changed, though they did. Because I stopped waiting for them to change on their own.